Welcome to Unlocking Astrology. Hello, everyone, from wherever you're joining us. And thank you, Samuel Reynolds, the key master himself, the founder of unlockastrology.com. Hello there.
Hello, Karen. How are you?
I'm good. You know, we are making our trek here, and I'm grateful again because I'm feeling less, somebody in the chat was like, thank you, because I was raised a Christian and I was raised to believe this is, demonic and that we shouldn't pursue this. And we've talked about this in previous lessons. So y'all can go back and look at that. Actually, we've had this conversation a couple of times, but I feel less spooky about having these conversations with you. And I was like, me too. I also was raised to believe this is witchcraft and all of this other stuff, numerology. And we, the Bible talks about divinity, divination, and we shouldn't be pursuing that. But I feel more enlightened, and not from this woo-woo place, but that, we are taking a scientific historic journey. And this is just one more element to examine yourself through. It's not
correct
more than that. But so thank you.
Yeah, and I've had a number of clients like this over the years, and and I also understand it because I've come from that world too. A couple different ways, at least one fully immersed in the religious Christian tradition, and then kind of dealing with it from the Muslim tradition, more, not as fully immersed, but, having to think about, since I was committed to the Islamic way of life, what does that mean, for me as an astrologer as well. So I'm very sympathetic to that feeling. And like I said, there are ways in which you can lose sight of the divine if you kind of become too preoccupied with, using astrology or using divination, that you're not also attentive to faith. Because sometimes you can have a paralysis of analysis with anything.
Period. And pray to false idols or worship false idols in many different ways. We do it, if we really examine ourselves, which is the goal. So I thought it would be interesting because somebody wanted to also know about Black people. You have done, in the past, we've had conversations about, 1619 and what that chart looked like. And you recently also did, Derek Chauvin's chart. You did Minneapolis's chart. And somebody said, I would love to see a chart of Black people. And I was like, is that a thing? And you said, yeah. So
let's talk about that. So let me share my screen and let me go to the share. So I've given a talk on this a few times, and I call it the astrological destiny of African Americans. And obviously, we're not going to give the talk. The talk is 90 minutes, but I want to give the short answer to this question, and then some of the things I talk about here. So I talk about the African presence in the Americas, and there's various different ways by which we can look at it. But I want to show at least one chart about the first Africans. And when I say the first Africans, I know this is controversial, so let me clarify. There are many people who are of the school of thought that Africans have been here, in the Americas, whether we're talking about, and this is why I also make homage to the Olmec heads in Mexico. So it's not me saying that there were no Africans before roughly sometime between August 25th, August 30th, because I'm going to give you two dates in contemplating the presence of Africans in America.
So more than it being, because before Columbus, I mean, clearly, there are maize, corn on the hieroglyphs in Africa. So clearly there was some sailing here, the ocean blue, and some
Abubakari.
Yeah, I'm saying, like, that's not a natural crop in Africa. So that it exists in Africa in hieroglyphs, that Africans wrote about corn, means that there was some sort of exchange, that there are pyramids in both places means that there was some sort of exchange, right? In Mexico and in, of course, Africa, where the Great Pyramids are. So we're not saying that, but I think what we're doing here is the beginnings of bondage, the beginnings of the denigration of Black people. Black people have been here since the beginning. So to do a chart of Black people was to do a chart of people, of humanity.
And at one particular point of a particular set of people. So in the question, and there's a ongoing question, especially if we get into Signology. What are Black people? Are we Pisces people? Are we Cancer people? Are we Aries people? Blah, blah, blah. And there are ways in which classically, you know, different nations, different kinds of people were divvied up, right? So supposedly England, Britannia was seen as Aries nation, even though it officially became, you know, England December 25th, I think 1066, with William the Conqueror becoming the King of England, right? That's its official coronation. Now, there are particular dates related to nations. So when people ask, like, well, what are we as a people? Well, one, I think the key thing to remember is that we are the embodiment of the zodiac, all of us, right? So it's not like, oh, well, you know, Black people, we're Cancer people. And I know some astrologers have said that, or we're Pisces people. You know, if we're African, and I do claim myself as African, you know, am I talking about myself in diaspora? Or are we talking about, you know, on the continent? That might be, quote unquote, two different sets of people. But I like to focus on particular charts rather than just saying there's one chart that highlights the story of African people or Africans in the Americas. So this is one particular chart that I use. Now, this is actually a rectified chart from an astrologer, Mark Penfield, who's I believe, a white astrologer, from August 30th, 1619, 10 a.m., Hampton. I want to show folks, I also have the discovery of Brazil, you know, the American chart, the Sibley chart. I'll get to maybe another time of Virginia Dare. But here's another chart that was proposed by a brother. His name is Vernon Robinson Jr. at Norwalk. And he's using around that same time frame. Anyone who paid attention to the 1619 project from the New York Times will be familiar with that. There's a time frame for when the first Africans arrived. And it's not that we actually, according to the date books, have an actual date. And rectification, for those who are not familiar with that word or the process, is where we take particular significant events from someone's life. But now we're talking about African Americans, and you do sleuth work to try to figure out backwards what might be the date or the time. So for instance, let's say, Karen, you didn't know your birth time. I would ask you, or say, can you give me 20 significant dates in your life, like when your father passed, or when this thing happened, or when you had your first, well, I guess your only marriage, these particular things. I would take those dates and see how they would line up with a hypothetical chart that I will start to formulate to figure out the time that matches most of those dates or events in your life. So that's the process of rectification. It was a service that I used to offer more readily. I haven't done a rectification in a year because, to be honest, I don't have as much time, right, to do it. But that was something I used to do. So this is a rectified chart where Vernon came up with this time of 1206. Now, the one thing I will say, there's not a big difference between the charts, believe it or not, even though there's some measure of degrees. We both have the sun in Virgo for this particular time frame. Mars is opposite to Pluto, which I will clarify as very significant. Both have Scorpio rising in the chart. The only big difference is that this has a moon in Pisces, and this other one has, a moon in Taurus. Now, I like both charts, but, you know, I think there's wisdom in both. So this particular chart really highlights, or both of these charts highlight really what was going on with these first Africans. So the story is that there were these Africans who were originally going to the Caribbean. They took over the ship. They end up, and it was called the White Lion, right? So this is even going with some more irony. And then they end up, not necessarily, because a lot of people say that there's another part of Virginia that they end up, but they were actually in Hampton, or what we now call Hampton. And they ended up there. And they were indentured servants. And so this is usually how they're described, as indentured servants. Now, technically, as we've been able to find in history, they may have had some point of manumission. But this is also the point, as we have now more Africans coming into the New World, whether we're talking about as far as Massachusetts or far north, or even in Virginia. This is also the point, the transition point, where more and more people were as indentured servants, then were reduced to slaves, right? And didn't have that period of manumission at all, where, more and more white people became afraid that when all these Black people here, maybe we need to like constrain them and blah, 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 both in Massachusetts, where there was no quote unquote formal, supposedly no formal slavery, but then also down in the South. So this was a transition point. And this chart, both of these charts actually capture that story. How? So Mars is in Scorpio, and it's highlighted and it's rising in the chart. Now, we wouldn't be able to see Mars with the naked eye if we were looking, because it's daylight, so for their supposed arrival here. But Mars is in an opposition to Pluto. That's straight up power struggle. That also can be symbolic of rape. It can also be symbolic of where one loses some sense of power and authority in one's life. I talked about Pluto before as where one has the sense of power, but also in terms of how we experience depth, not death, literally, although Pluto can also relate to death, but where you're pulled into the vortex, the depth of things. So with that Mars-Pluto opposition, it really does highlight the key element of what our story became. And dealing with also Venus being at the top of the chart, Venus, right here, what I'm pointing to, that's significant in a lot of different ways. But one of the things that I also talk about in this lecture, where I give on the African-American destiny, is how much of this started off with sugarcane, how much of this started off with white people needing sweet things, right? It wasn't cotton at first, right? The maturation of enslavement goes from just off the coast of Africa, right? In terms, I believe, the Canary Islands and developing crops that are related to sugar. Then someone decides, like as people discover the New World for Europeans, that we could also export and deal with that crop there. And then that's when we also have enslaved people going toward, in terms of the Caribbean and then into North America. So this makes me think of Venus, both charts, being at the top of the chart, dealing with the sweetness of things. But Venus also signifies, especially with her being in Leo, where we might shine related to Venusian things, entertainment, sports to some dimension, where we also shine in relation to that sense of talent being at the top of the chart. So I think that also gives the story in which we're, involved in the story of America. We can see here that this is a full moon, right? This particular chart, the August 25th chart, the August 30th chart is more along the lines after it's more so going toward a quarter moon. So this is more like a disseminating moon. And again, we don't know the exact date, the exact time, but we can conjecture sometime between the 25th and the 30th as the arrival for these indentured Africans. But like I said, there's a lot of similarities between them. And, people might say like, well, why Virgo, right? In terms of that time frame, why do you think Virgo matches? Think about the skill set and the level of work that we brought into this country, right? I mean, that's very important. I mean, Virgo really highlights, and this is something I talked about when we talked about the signs. Virgo, really does get into the measure of work, skill, refinement, aspects of practicality. We built this nation. This is incontrovertible to me, at least, and I think also to you, in terms of the level of work, also the level of skill. A lot of people don't realize that, many of the enslaved Africans who came here came also with skills, right? Being able to do things. They just weren't like, you're out there doing things. There was, you're out in the field, there were metal workers. Definitely, if we had been allowed to use our languages, there were people who were skilled in their languages, not just in terms of griot. A lot of things, one thing to remember about West African history is that it was as we might describe it, a melting pot of various cultures and various people, including Islamic people who were well-versed in the Quran, well-versed in Arabic aspects of learning. Like I mentioned, metalwork, aspects of medicine, all these different skill sets that we came with by virtue of, and that's Virgo, especially with the Mercury being very strong in Virgo. There's a lot of strength to this chart. And that is a testament to the strength of the people who were brought in under forcible conditions and would come to be some measure of forcible conditions. It may not have initially started with that in the first generation, but by the time that we got to the second generation, it was so.
This is infuriating on so many levels because, you know, our history has been distilled into like these folks packed like sardines in the holds of ships. At least that's the history that I was taught in my Catholic school. That was the one chapter on slavery, and that was all we learned about Black people. And you know, you just see them in their loincloths, their naked breasts, and all you see are savages. You don't see the doctors. You don't see the people who speak 5 languages. You don't see the mothers and the fathers and the brothers and the uncles. You don't see the leaders. You don't see the mathematicians and the scientists. You don't see the metal workers and the great artisans and the farmers who actually literally brought rice to the Carolinas and indigo and all of the things that made America and the Americas and France and England and other places great. Lumber out of the Congo, literally built nations off of our labor and ingenuity and intelligence. And that's never synonymous, and that's never really spoken about. So,
and it's right here in the chart. I mean,
yeah, I'm grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's there as the testimony. So, and I do want to say this. So this is not the chart for all of African American history. You know, we don't, even though I talk a lot about this chart related to American history, and this is just one chart that some astrologers use called the Sibley chart. And it's more of a hypothetical chart. There are other people who question, was the actual Declaration of Independence signed at 5:10 p.m.? And some people also use more the Articles of Confederation chart, which was later. So, you know, one of the reasons why you might see a couple different charts that I'm mentioning here, I also talk about Venus cycles. Venus is also, I think, very important in African-American history. And I'll get into this. This is actually my friend, Nick Dagan Best. And he talks about the cycles of Venus. He's a Canadian. So he didn't have necessarily, and he's, you know, I think a very cool dude, you know, he didn't have a vested interest in doing research related to like, oh, I gotta, you know, look at what's happening with Black Americans and blah, blah, blah. He was more so, what is happening with Venus when he looks at particular cycles related to her retrograde, which happens roughly in terms of, you know, every few years along a particular cycle. And to find out, he just wanted to see what happens. This is kind of his research. And what he noticed, it seemed to be paralleling, you know, very strong events in Black American history related to injustice and cycles of justice, injustice, and racism. Now, that stood out for me, especially seeing Venus was at the top of the chart. And one of the things, now this is only one marker. I think some people have been up in arms, including some Black people, like, are you just saying that like virtue of looking at one planet, you can talk about when we can expect disruption in America? No, or with African Americans. But, you know, Venus is a planet which talks about creating harmony, can also talk about, by ways of talking about harmony, what is disharmonious, meaning, you know, like also creates dislike, right? If you talk about like, well, I love, you know, this, you know, I love our people so much, and this is kind of argument that you hear from certain people. I don't mean like just in terms of Black people. I mean, I'll just say it, white people. You know, it's not like I don't like, you know, Negroes or Black people. I just really like prefer to be around my own, right? I don't know why I'm taking on that Southern accent for it, but you get the idea. But this is a certain sensibility that he was highlighting. Now, why is this important? Well, one of the things, looking at the Venus cycle from 2012, and then looking at 2020, when Venus retrogrades in Gemini, is that we see immediate parallels between someone dying, right, and getting killed, even though this is kind of more of a thing, but in terms of how it exploded in 2012, I was able to predict, 2020 is probably going to be explosive along the same lines, because Venus is going to go in her retrograde cycle in Gemini, as she does every 8 years, at this particular time. And sure enough, we did have like a very explosive 2020 related to that. So this is something to.
So 2012 was Trayvon Martin. 2020 was George Floyd.
Yes. Right. And also what was interesting, around the same time in February of 2020, I'm blanking on the brother's name who was killed by these vigilantes in his neighborhood, or in their neighborhood. What's the brother's name?
Ahmaud Arbery. Ahmaud Arbery.
Yes. Yeah. So, and that was covered up like Trayvon Martin for at least a month or two before it became more public knowledge. So we had these same issues. So, where I say affection, confection, disaffection, where we can have these different issues, but, there are different charts that we can look at related to these particular moments in our history, whether we're talking about this in terms of the birth of, Black Lives Matter, or, I talked about it in relation to Venus, but there's all these other charts, the slave rebellion in Haiti, where we can talk about it from August 14th, 1791, the destruction of Palmares in Brazil, right? Where we also have these moments where we look at, again, Taurus is rising.
Wait, that's 1694?
Yeah.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And Palmares is significant, especially, I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of Palmares. That was the Quilombo, and the Quilombos that were in Brazil, and this was the main Quilombo where you had bastions of resistance of Africans, some of them who had long escaped enslavement in Brazil. Because one thing to remember is that Brazil was probably the focal point for enslavement in the New World, right? And then also has, as we now know, the greatest number of people of African descent outside of Africa, right? So this was the destruction of a community of people who, from February 6, 1694, that time is approximate. I don't know the actual time in which it was actually destroyed. I haven't done a rectification related to it. You might say like, okay, this is just a chart, and I'm not expounding on it as much as it is interesting to notice that the polarity, 16 degrees Taurus, might be rising related to it. But I'm kind of bringing up these different charts to highlight that there's no one chart, right? As much as we can talk about these individual charts, including the first chart I showed, as highlighting the struggles of African people in the Americas. Nat Turner's rebellion, from August 21st, 1831, Southampton, Virginia. Then I also look at the Emancipation Proclamation, which is an interesting chart. We also see Mars is very active in that chart. Where we're dealing with the aspects of struggle in this country. Supposedly Saturn is exalted and Libra, and conjoined to the ascendant. You might say like this is a point of freedom, but it really was a point of also dealing with our burden, because Neptune, the planet that deals with illusion, delusion, is right also opposite to it. So it was always kind of a shaky promise and a shaky statement. And again, to note that it was January 1st, 1863. But as most people know, especially with Juneteenth, it wasn't until, I won't say many, but several years later, where it actually became like more of an actual thing. And then, I talk about some other interesting tidbits, in terms of August being a very critical month in the history of Black people. And I just highlight some particular dates that stand out related to what happens in August. We talk about Black August, but I don't think a lot of people, especially, some astrologers, talk about so much that has happened related to our history. Note the San Quentin Rebellion is the same date as Nat Turner's rebellion, August 21st. But this was 1971. First indentured Africans arrived in Virginia. Gabriel Prosser and Nat Turner started their slave rebellions. Black nationalist Marcus Mosiah Garvey was born. The Underground Railroad was formed. Dr. King delivers his I Have a Dream speech, which is pretty much just a day after W.E.B. Du Bois passed away. Fannie Lou Hamer also the day after the rebellion, San Quentin, and also in terms of Annette Turner delivers her famous Democratic speech at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. And what's interesting also about this that I don't know if I draw in here. Yeah, I talk about the dog star Sirius, which in Egypt we used to call it Sotpet, or now we call it Sirius, the dog star, rises pretty much now in August and has been for the last several hundred years. And that's interesting to me, considering the long history of African people who've centered much of their cosmology around the dog star, including the Egyptians, but also the people of Burkina Faso, who, we call the Dogon, or they call themselves the Dogon people. Mm. So they also honor that same sense. And so I also think this might be an interesting August too, August 2021. I think that's often, a galvanizing month for Black folks.
Well, the other trial of the other officers starts.
Which one?
The Derek Chauvin, the other officers that.
Involves that case, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So
there's literally dog in the Dogon people's name.
It is. Although I think that's unintentional. But yeah, it is.
I mean, but who named a dog a dog? Did the Egyptians call them dogs? Like, I feel like
no, I don't. Well,
everything needs to be re-examined, Samuel.
Well, why is it called the dog star? I know that particular, because Sotpet is not related, wasn't called by the dog star. It's called, Sotpet is said to be the wife of Sahu, the hidden one, the constellation of Orion, and mother of the falcon god, Sopdu, representing Venus. So it was feminine. It wasn't seen as dog. That, I believe, the dog star was given from the Romans or Greeks, and it was called, so you've heard like the dog days of summer. Mm-hmm. The dog days of summer directly come from the idea of Sirius rising, but that was also probably correlated to where the dogs are, panting and hot and all these different things. The other reason is that the name of the star that Sirius belongs to is called Canis Major, right? So that's also
Canis, which is Latin. Okay, got it.
So anyway, so the other charts I look at and talk about in this lecture, in terms of famous or notable people in African-American history, Frederick Douglass. I talk about what I would conjecture as the hypothetical chart of Booker T. Washington, also his opponent, W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And then also his other opponent, Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Then we do have a chart, we believe, for Malcolm X and Haj Malik El-Shabazz. And then we also have Martin Luther King's chart, which we also believe we have the accurate birth time. Fannie Lou Hamer, we do not have her actual time, but this is also someone important to pay attention to. Barack Obama. And I go through the themes related to that. I mean, I'm not doing it now. I even looked at the whole Black Panther moment, and looking at it in terms of Ryan Coogler's chart, in terms of what that might mean. What was interesting for me is that Ryan Coogler's chart, which we do have a birth time for him, is exactly conjoined to that Venus that I talked about in the indentured servant's arrival in Hampton, Virginia. And it also, he has a Scorpio rising. And then, we see some other kind of correlations. So there's a lot of different tie-ins, especially that he has related to that initial chart I showed. So does Ava DuVernay. She actually, her sun is nearly conjoined. Now, one thing I will say about Ava, and I've said it before and I'll go on record, I think Ava's work will be very important and has already proven important, but I said this years ago, in African-American history. By virtue of, there's a lot of parallels that she has in her chart related to that indentured servant chart. And I looked at the premiere of Selma. I've also looked at the premiere of Roots and not here in this particular talk, but I also looked at the premier roots, and I've also looked at even Alex Haley's chart. So, I mean, I'm not trying to give the whole lecture because we don't have as much time, but this is some of the things I look at. So to answer the question that this person asked, what's the chart of Black people? Well, we have multiple charts, but we can start with, like, especially if we're talking about African Americans, perhaps that indentured servant chart. You might say, like, why don't you start with the Olmec chart? Or why don't you start with this? Because we don't know when they came.
Right. Wow, that was enlightening. And as you were talking, I was thinking, I'm like, okay, who else's chart? And what about Sirius?
Yeah, well, Sirius is Sirius. I mean, Sirius is, I think, an important planet star, because the Dogon have fascinating things to say about it. So, for instance, Europeans believe that it's a binary star system, right? Where there are two stars that circle around each other. There's Sirius A and Sirius B. Dogon disagree. Dogon believe that there are three. It's a tertiary star system. And so they call the one star, the C star, they call that the star for women. So they have a special ceremony in their tradition, in their history, that is related to, like, initiation for women. So
yeah, we have work to do to reclaim all of that good history, all of that stuff that happened, because it actually happened, so that we can get back to who we really are.
Yeah, and integrate more different lessons from African cosmology, because this is why, even though I have focused more on being a Western astrologer, let's be clear, multiple cultures, especially within Africa, have an astrology, right? It may not work the same way. When I say work the same way, I don't mean that, I mean, it definitely worked for the Africans who used them, but they may not have counted time or used time the same way. They may have thought about time more in a cyclical sense. Europeans are the people who crafted this, linear sense of time that seems to, expand ad infinitum into, like, the darkness of time and history. But African people thought more cyclically, and they also thought more in terms of peoplehood, meaning that, an event, they wouldn't start like, okay, we meet at 2:00. Okay, let's meet, as the sun rises or as the sun reaches this, going toward its height. And even when the sun would reach that exact point, the event, the energy of that event wouldn't start until the people had gathered and everyone had come, right? And people say, like, well, that's CP time. It was the nature of time that was conditioned by the people who used time, not being slaves to time, not thinking that time is its own thing. Time really is in relation and in a dynamic with people.
Ooh, and if a group gets the opportunity to write history for everybody, and they have no soul and no connection to humanity, what does that look like? That's rhetorical.
No, well, I'm glad you said that. I mean, I know it's rhetorical, but that's a huge thing. I've actually given a lecture on that, and actually Larry was at that lecture where I said, when people can control your notion of time, they can control you. This is why astrology is important as kind of a contradistinction to living, more on a global or cosmic sense of time rather than that. Because the nature of the Western mind and Western history is to keep parceling out different notions of time. Like, we used to live more by hours, now it's going more by minutes, and now we're even trying to live by nanoseconds, right? And so this piecemealing of time and kind of creating this notion of time really gets away more from the larger sense of our connection to the cosmos.
Let's explore that. Let's do a whole chart on time.
Okay.
But we're out of time right now. And so let me thank you. Thank you for this. It was very enlightening, as always. Follow him at SF Reynolds on Twitter. And of course, unlockastrology.com to get your chart read. Thank you, Sam Reynolds.
Thank you.